Welcome. Glad you're here. And today we're going to be covering Learning Plan 7. Phone here. So we're going to be covering Learning Plan 7 today. And Learning Plan 7 is actually kind of a fun learning plan. It's not super hard, but it's kind of a little bit of fun to talk about the different laws, talk about breathing mechanics and stuff like that. It's a pretty light learning plan, and it's understandable, it's relatable, so it's a lot of fun. This is one of my favorite learning plans to cover because it challenges you a little bit, but it's not really bad. And so what we're going to be discussing in this learning plan, as you can see, it says the mechanics of maintaining adequate tissue perfusion and oxygenation. So basically, how do we ensure that your body gets as much oxygen as it needs? Specifically your body's tissues. That's what we're looking at. So how do you get oxygen to the tissues? And sort of related to that is, how do we get rid of the byproduct as far as gases, which would be carbon dioxide. So we're breathing in oxygen, or breathing all sorts of gases, but how is it that we can get oxygen from the environment to our tissues? And how is it that we get the carbon dioxide, which is the byproduct of our cellular metabolism? How do we get that out and breathe that out? That's what we're going to discover today. So it's pretty interesting, but it all happens naturally, and you're going to see why it happens. And it's pretty intuitive once you know the rules and you kind of know why it's doing it. There are certain laws or rules, and once you know those, it's pretty easy. So we're going to be throwing at you a couple of laws today. They're not hard. The hardest part is just keeping it straight. Who said what? Who did what? But other than that, it's pretty straightforward. So first of all, what we need to do is we need to look at the pressures. The pressures, atmospheric pressure, the different pressures in the different areas of the respiratory system and so forth. Again, we're not going to be hitting on the anatomy of the respiratory system, because that's something that you already have knowledge of. At least I would hope so. Especially the anatomy of the respiratory system. It's one of the more easily learned systems there. There's not a lot to it. It's just basically a network of tubes, your airways. So what we're going to focus on today is we're going to focus on the relationships between the atmospheric pressure and the pressures that we see in our lungs, and how through the mechanics of breathing we're able to bring air into our lungs, and how we get air out of our lungs. And we do it without even thinking, but it's because of the way nature has things set up, pretty fascinating, that allows us to do it. So first of all, let's take a look at these pressure relationships. So what we see here, we have a couple of different areas that we are looking at. First of all, we have the atmospheric pressure here. Wake up, Mr. Penn. There we go, the atmospheric pressure. And we're going to just assume that this is kind of like an average atmospheric pressure at sea level, 760 millimeters mercury. And then we have the intrapulmonary pressure. This is going to vary, but if no air is moving in or out of our lungs, the pressure of the air pushing against the lungs is going to be also 760 millimeters mercury. Why you see a 0 here, it's telling you the difference in pressure between the intrapulmonary pressure and the atmospheric pressure, which right now is, right? You can see the same. All right. Then we have an intrapleural pressure. So remember, Then when we look at body cavities, we have two layers to the body cavity. When we talk about the serous membranes, we have a parietal layer. Remember the parietal layer? What does the parietal layer line? Does it line the cavity, or does it line the actual organ? Which one do you think? What do you remember? Got it. Is that what you were going to say? Yeah, the cavity. It lines the cavity. So the parietal layer lines the cavity. If you didn't know that, parietal pleura. So then we have the other layer, which is the visceral layer, which lines the organ itself. Okay? So hopefully that comes back to you. So in between the two, we have a space. And that's in the lungs. It's called a pleural cavity because it's referring to the lungs, plural. So between the parietal pleura and the visceral pleura, there's a space. And in that the pleural cavity, you can see that on average, the pressure is 4 millimeters mercury less than intrapulmonary pressure. So this is a negative pressure. So when you apply a negative pressure, what happens? Is it a suction, or is it a what would be the opposite of suction? Blowing? I don't know. So would it be when you have a negative pressure? Is that going to be a suction, an action of suction, or is it going to be an action of extrusion or outward movement? What do you think? Suction is correct, right? So one of the more readily available examples of suction that we use is drinking from a straw, right? So what's happening when you are drinking from a straw? Think about what's happening inside your mouth. What are you doing? Put the straw between your lips, stick the straw in your mouth, and then what do you do? Suck, right? But what are you doing? What's happening? I should have brought water and straws so you can see what happened. What's happening? Yeah, what's happening in your mouth? What does your tongue do to bring the beverage into your mouth? You ever think about it?
No.
You're gonna have to do it. We'll talk about that. You never thought about that, but now you're thinking, right? You're thinking. Okay. Think about that. All right. We'll come up with the answer. I'll give the answer in a little bit. I'll give you something to think about. All right. So anyway, between the lung and the body cavity, we have a negative pressure. So what this is going to do is this is actually going to pull on the lung and sort of hold the lungs in a position of inflation beyond what they normally would. Okay? So normally your lungs would be smaller and they would recoil more, but they don't, because you have this intrapleural pressure that's keeping the lungs a little bit more inflated than they normally would be. It's basically pulling the lungs open with that negative pressure. All right? And then we have something called the transpulmonary pressure, which is not really that important in our discussion here, but it's basically showing you that the difference in the pressure between inside the lung and outside the lung is 4 millimeters mercury, but we determined that already because we see that the intrapleural pressure is 4 millimeters mercury less than this one. Because if you take 760 millimeters mercury at rest and you subtract from it 756, and you easily see that we get 4. And that's what they're trying to show you here. So are you all following me on this? Everything's square? Okay. So if you understand this picture and you understand what's going on, you should have no problem understanding what we're going to discuss initially today, because what we're talking about is the pressure and what happens to the pressure when we're breathing. So the fancy term for breathing, if you look in your notes on page 1, is letter B, pulmonary ventilation. I mean, that's basically the mechanical process allowing the air to flow into and out of the lungs, according to the volume changes in the thoracic cavity. All right, so here's our first law, Boyle's law. Boyle's law states that at a constant temperature, the pressure of a gas varies inversely with its volume. All right, so it sounds worse than it is. So I'm going to show you how I make sense of Boyle's law, and I'll draw it out for you and I'll show you, but let's just talk about this for a second here. Okay, I know Boyle's law applies to gases and not really solids, but the way I look at Boyle's law, and I can make sense of it, is through a visualization. Does everybody know what a Nerf ball is? Like Nerf footballs? Kind of like a spongy type of ball? Okay, so imagine in my hand, I have a ball made out of a sponge. It's a small ball. Okay, a little bigger than the size of a golf ball. Okay, and that little, but think of like a clown's nose. How about that? The foam clown nose, you know. So you got this little red foam clown nose sitting on my hand here. Okay, it occupies a certain amount of space, a certain amount of volume, right? Okay. What happens if I apply pressure to that ball? What happens if I squeeze it? It means I'm increasing the pressure. What happens to the volume of that ball? How much space does that ball take up? More or less? Less. So can you see the inverse relationship between pressure and volume? The more pressure I apply, the less volume it occupies? Yeah. And how about if I release the pressure? How about if I decrease the pressure? What happens to the volume of that ball? Increases. So that's the inverse relationship between pressure and volume that Boyle is talking about, except it applies to gases. Okay, same principle. It's easier sometimes when you think about it as a physical object, right? Instead of gas, which we can't see. So if you increase the pressure, you decrease the volume. Or if you decrease the volume, what are you doing to the pressure? Increasing it. It's inversely related. Okay, so that's what Boyle's law is stating. Simple as that. And if you understand Boyle's law, then you'll understand the mechanics behind breathing and pulmonary ventilation. So Boyle's law states that at a constant temperature, pressure is inversely related to volume. So we can do it two different ways. If we increase, oopsie. If we increase the pressure, that's going to be what for the volume? Decreased volume, right? Okay. What happens if we decrease the volume? Increase what? The pressure, right? Yeah. So it works both ways. You can either increase the pressure to decrease the volume, or you can decrease the volume and increase the pressure. Either one works. Gets you the same place. What happens if you decrease the pressure? What happens to the volume? It increases the volume. What happens if we increase the volume? Focus on this one. Okay. So we have this muscle down here called the diaphragm, right? What does the diaphragm do? What does the diaphragm do when it contracts? Does it move up or down? What's that? When you're breathing out, it goes up and down. But when the diaphragm contracts, when a muscle contracts, it only moves in one direction. So what do you think? Down or up? Or don't you know? You don't know. Okay, that's all right. You know, with all the stuff you have to learn, hard to remember everything. when the diaphragm contracts, it moves down. So it goes from a dome-like position to more flattened. Okay? So if I were to, so if you look at if you look at this entire thoracic cavity here that contains the lungs, if I drop the diaphragm down, what's that going to do to the volume of the thoracic cavity, pleural cavities? If I drop the diaphragm, is that going to make the volume bigger or smaller? Bigger. You make it bigger, right? Yeah, absolutely. So if I drop the diaphragm, contract the diaphragm, what am I doing to the volume? Increasing it. So what's that going to do to the pressure of this cavity, of the gas inside this cavity? It's going to decrease. Yeah. Okay. So let's say that I drop the volume inside the lungs. This is the intrapulmonary pressure. Let's say I drop that 760 to 756. Does atmospheric pressure change? I'm in the same place? No, it does not. Okay, so which is higher? 760 or 756? Which one's higher? Atmospheric pressure of 760 is higher. Okay, so here's what happens. When we have some sort of barrier with a channel through it, and we have a certain pressure here, a certain pressure here. We increase the pressure here, and we have a higher pressure on one side of the membrane than the other, but there's a channel for the air to pass through. Is it going to move from high to low or low to high pressure? High to low. High to low. Each and every time. Okay? So come back to the lungs. If we have 760 here and we have 756 inside the lungs, which one is higher? Atmospheric pressure. So following what we just determined here, if you have an area of high pressure versus low pressure, and you have a channel for it to pass through, which way is the air going to move? Into the lungs or out of the lungs? Yes, high to low. Air moves into the lungs. That's how we bring air into our lungs. Increase the volume of the pleural cavity. By doing that, we decrease the pressure. When we do that, air moves from an area of high to low pressure. That's it. Air is going to continue to move into the lungs until what happens? Go ahead.
Isn't it until it reaches capacity and then?
You're close. You're on the right track. Do me a favor, take a breath in and hold it. Just breathe in and hold it. The air's not moving after a while, right? Stay stagnant. Why is it staying stagnant? How can you get air to stop moving from here to here? What do we have to do? Pressure has to become equalized, right? So air will continue to go into your lungs until what? Until the pressure equalizes, right? So now, once you fill up the pleural cavity with a certain volume of air, the pressure is going to equalize. Okay? So now you're back to even again. So eventually, as you fill this up, that pressure is going to get back to the same as atmospheric pressure, so it will become 760 because it's filling the volume. See, right now, what happens is when you drop the diaphragm, you need to, with that increase in volume, you need to fill it with something. And because it's not completely filled yet, that's when you get the differential in pressure bringing air into the lungs. Once the air completely fills that cavity, now we equalize the pressure again. So now we're equal again. Once we bring all the air into your lungs, we're equal. But what happens after you're done holding your breath? what happens? What happens to the diaphragm? When you flex a muscle, you contract a muscle, what does the muscle do when it's not contracting? What's that? It releases, it relaxes, right? It relaxes. So what happens with the diaphragm when it relaxes? If it went down when it contracted, what's the diaphragm going to do when it relaxes? It's going to go up. So if you're pushing the diaphragm upward, what's that going to do to the volume of the pleural cavity? Going to decrease the volume, which means what's going to happen to the pressure inside that cavity? You're pointing upward, right? It's going to increase. So let's say now that we increase that to 764 millimeters mercury. Got a lot of stuff scribbled here on the screen. So now we brought the diaphragm up. We went from 760 now to 764 inside the lungs. Which one's higher, 764 or 760? 764. So if we have a barrier with a channel and we have higher pressure on one side than the other, which way is it going to go? From high to low, right? So we have high pressure inside the lungs, low pressure outside. So which way is air going to move? Out of the lungs. Until what happens? Until what? Until it equalizes again, right? And then we're back where we started. Here, see? That's it. That's Boyle's law. Isn't that exciting? But it's pretty easy to understand, right? Once you get it, diaphragm drops, volume increases, pressure decreases, air comes in. Diaphragm relaxes, means you decrease the volume, increase the pressure, air moves out. And that's how you breathe. That's it. So you're just bringing air into and out of the lungs. That's how you breathe. It's the mechanics of breathing. Now we do have other muscles that can help with bringing air into and out of the lungs. Now, on average, the diaphragm only drops maybe a centimeter or two during normal restful breathing. It doesn't have to drop much. And with that centimeter or two of a drop, that's enough to change the pressure by about that, 4 millimeters mercury or so. But that's enough. That's enough to bring, bless you. That's enough to bring, on average, about a half liter of air into your lungs. That's all you really need. That's normal. And we're talking about lung volumes and so forth as we move on, but that's about all you need. But we also have some other muscles like the intercostals. So the external intercostals, the internal intercostals, and they're involved in breathing. And we see pictures of that here. So when we breathe in, this is figure 22.3. When we bring in, it might be hard for you to see from where you are, but just turn to that picture in your book. You can see that we have the external intercostals contracting, which pulls the ribs outward and up. So if we're pulling the ribs up and outward, we're increasing the volume of the thoracic cavity, and the diaphragm descends too. So the thoracic cavity volume increases. The lungs will bring the air in. Intrapulmonary pressure drops, and then air flows into the lungs. When we breathe out, it's basically just recoil, elastic recoil during normal restful breathing, just elastic recoil. So it's just like a big elastic balloon that goes whoosh, and it just recoils. That's enough to push the air out. If we want to forcibly push the air out of our lungs, then we can contract the internal intercostals, and we can also use our abdominal muscles to increase intra-abdominal pressure to force the air out as well. So we have just normal restful breathing, and we also have forced breathing. Now, there are some things that affect our ability to ventilate. Airway resistance is one on top of page 2, letter C now. Airway resistance. That's just the friction caused by the airways rubbing, coming into contact with the air. Greatest in the medium-sized airways, we talk about. Also, alveolar surface tension. This is an important thing to think of. We'll talk about that, but I just want to jump to the next one, which is lung compliance. When you talk about compliance, it means how elastic are the lungs. So if you're looking at a rubber band that can be easily stretched and manipulated, that has a high compliance. But something that's very rigid and it's not very stretchy, doesn't have a lot of give to it, that's a low compliance. Okay, so compliance is how flexible is the substance. And so obviously if you have lungs that have a high compliance, that's going to aid your pulmonary ventilation and allow you to ventilate much more readily than if you had a low compliance. So people who have a chronic obstructive pulmonary disorder, they have cystic fibrosis, or they have some sort of condition that decreases the elasticity of the lungs, that's going to be decreased compliance. So they're going to have a harder time ventilating. They're going to have a harder time bringing the air into and out of their lungs. But one of the things I wanted to talk about, it takes just a little bit of time to talk about, and that's why I wanted to hit that one last, is the concept of alveolar surface tension. Okay, so think about your lungs. You have the alveoli in your lungs, which are these big sacs, basically. And they inflate to allow the air to come in, the gases to come in, and then as you breathe out, they collapse. All right? So what are the two main things? I mean, you're breathing out a mixture of gases, I understand that. But as far as the byproducts of your cellular metabolism, and I know we didn't get to metabolism yet in this class, but we talked a little bit about metabolism in general AP. What were the two byproducts from your cellular metabolism, your cellular respiration byproducts? What were they? Do you remember? Two of them. One's really obvious. What do you breathe out of your lungs? I mean, everybody knows this. You breathe in oxygen, you breathe out CO2. Yeah, carbon dioxide. That's one. Okay, that's one of them. Okay, that's not the one we're concerned with. What else do you breathe out of your lungs? What's something that you can do if you're not sure if someone's breathing? What do you hold up to the mouth? The airways. You see it in like movies and television shows and stuff like that. But they hold right with their mouth. Some women carry it in their purse, cosmetics. Sure. Okay. So why would you hold a mirror to someone's nose or mouth if you're not sure they're breathing? What are you looking for? What's that?
Like foggy. Like
yeah, foggy. What's causing the fog? What are they breathing out? What causes condensation? What's creating the fog on the mirror? If I have a really, really cold beverage with ice in it, it's glass. I sit it down on a nice hot summer day. What's going to form on the outside of the glass? You know this. What's the condensation? What is it made up of? Horns? Wood? What is it made up of? It's right. You're going to say it. Water. Yeah. So when someone breathes on a mirror and you see the condensation, what's causing the condensation? Water. That's the second thing you breathe out, water vapor. So inside of the alveoli, you have water. And see, water has a surface tension to it. Why do you lick a suction cup before you stick it down on a table? Why? Because it sticks better, right? That's because water, when in close proximity of other water molecules, they form a hydrogen bond, stick together. It's called surface tension. So water has the ability to create what we call surface tension through those hydrogen bonds, which can be a benefit, but it also can be a negative. And in our lungs, it's a negative because that alveolus is like one big old suction cup that if your alveolus collapses and now you've got water in there, now you have to get pressure high enough to exceed the water surface tension in order to open that alveolus back up again, which is hard to do. But naturally, our lungs counter this by creating something called surfactant, which is produced by the type 2 alveolar cells, which is kind of like a lipid. It's like a lipid, almost like an oily substance. So if you took a suction cup and you wiped it with oil before sticking it down, is it going to stick as effectively? No, because the oil breaks the surface tension of the water, right? Thus making the suction cup less effective. So that's what the surfactant does. The surfactant in your lungs will actually, that lipid breaks the water surface tension, so it requires less pressure to open up the alveoli to get air into your lungs. Does that make sense? Okay. So that's another factor. When infants are born, what's the last organ that develops in infants? Or the fetus, I should say, because they aren't born yet. What's the last organ to develop? The lungs, because they don't need them. They don't need them until they're born. So that's like the least important thing. So in prematurely born infants, their lungs aren't fully developed, so they don't create the surfactant yet. That's why babies who are born prematurely, a lot of times they have them on respirators because they're increasing the air pressure so that their lungs can open, so they can breathe more easily. So we have surfactant in our lungs that helps break that surface tension. Can I go through one more thing before we stop and review? Doesn't take long. All right. This figure, this is not what I wanted to go to next, but this figure just shows you how the pressures increase and decrease and how they change according to what we're doing when we breathe in and breathe out. Okay, so if that helps you, maybe it speaks to you, maybe it doesn't, but it's there. Showing you also, this picture here shows you the resistance, how in the medium-sized bronchi, that's where we have the most resistance to airflow. This is where I wanted to go. Now, what you may want to do is open up your book to this figure, which is 2216, because below it you should have something that looks like this, right? Okay, so that's what you want to focus on. So focus on both, but I'm not going to put both up because otherwise it's a really small picture and then you can't read it anyway. So I'm going to show you this, but I want you to have that other part open so you can follow along. All right, so when we do something called a spirograph, now spirometry has changed over the years. Now a lot of it's done with computers and it's computerized, so you don't have the old-fashioned spirograph that we used to have. But the old-fashioned spirograph, for people who still use it, it was like looked like a column, and it had a little pen on it that would go up and down. So let me show. Oopsie, what did I do here? Let me show you. So so there was a column. Say this is the column, and then there was a pen, and the pen would go up and down. So if someone took a breath in, it would move up, and then if they took a breath out, the pen would move down. Okay, because basically what was happening was it was attached to this device that was like a floating thing in water, and then when you breathe in, then it would move it in one direction and then it move it in a different direction when you breathe out and all that sort of thing. So what would happen is this thing would turn over time, and then as the person is breathing in and out, what it would do is it just record. So you see if I had a pen here, and it would start writing on the column. See that? So that's what it did. All right. Then what you do is you take the paper off of that column, you spread it out, and when you spread it out, it would look like what you see in your book, which is the spirograph. All right. Now again, nowadays they use a computerized model, so this is kind of antiquated. Maybe they still use it. I don't know if that's why they're showing it or what. But anyway, when you do look at the spirograph, though, you don't read it from left to right like we typically read a writing. You read a spirograph from right to left. So you read it in this direction. So this would be the start. This would be, got it? Remember, an upward movement means you breathe in. The downward movement means you're breathing out. Okay? So you can see here that it just goes up and down within this narrow light blue band here. This is called the tidal volume. And if you look in your book or you look in your notes, it says the tidal volume is the amount of air that moves in and out of the lungs with each breath during quiet breathing and averages 500 milliliters per breath, so half a liter. So when you're just breathing normally, the average individual will breathe in about a half liter of air, and then they'll breathe out that half liter of air during normal restful breathing. But now, if you tell that person, okay, what I want you to do is I want you to breathe in, breathe out, breathe in, and then push all the air out of your lungs, as much air as you possibly can. Okay? The difference between the normal tidal volume and the amount of air that you can completely push out is called the expiratory reserve volume. And that's about 1.2 liters. So that's letter C in your notes. If you're following your notes, it's the amount of air that can be evacuated from the lungs after tidal expiration. So this is the amount of air that you have at your disposal that you can breathe out forcibly, right? However, there's still another volume here in addition to that called the residual volume, and that would be letter D. It's the amount of air that remains in the lungs after maximal forced expiration, about 1,200 milliliters. So this is why the Heimlich maneuver works. Person, is not breathing, and then what you do is you apply pressure to the lungs. You can even tap into some of this residual volume, technically. So the takeaway here is that no matter how much air you try pushing out of your lungs, there's still an additional 1.2 liters left in your lungs that you don't have access to normally. Okay. People get the wind knocked out of them, and they're like freaking out because it feels like they don't have any air. If you ever got the wind knocked out of you, depends on what resource you read, but that would be like tapping into that residual volume a little bit. You're knocking some of that out, and then you got to get that back in. There's a little bit of panic because we're not used to existing without that extra residual volume in our lungs all the time. Okay, so let's say that ask you to take a deep breath and bring in as much air as you possibly can into your lungs. Breathe in, 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 and you just max out. You can't breathe any more air in. We call that the inspiratory reserve volume. So this is the amount of volume that you have at your disposal beyond the tidal volume. Okay, so this is like the amount of capacity that volume that you have at your disposal. This is the amount of, this is letter B, the amount of air that can be forcibly inspired beyond the tidal volume. We have those 4 volumes: tidal volume, expiratory reserve volume, residual volume, and then the inspiratory reserve. So if we combine some of the volumes, then we get these capacities. So the inspiratory capacity, for example, is the total capacity that you have of inspiration here. So if you were to inspire, which is to breathe in, your inspiratory capacity on average is about 3.6 liters. Okay. So as far as the amount of air that you can forcibly take into your lungs or forcibly push out, it's a combination of the inspiratory reserve. I'm sorry, yes, the inspiratory reserve, the tidal, and the expiratory reserve. That's the vital capacity. If you look at everything, the whole enchilada, as far as let me clear this off here so we don't have so much writing on here. If you look here, sorry, not the whole enchilada, right here, if you look at how much you have available in your lungs below the inspiratory capacity, you compare these two, combine these two, it's called the functional residual capacity. That's letter B way at the bottom of page 2. It's a combined residual volume. And it represents the amount of air that remains in the lungs after a tidal expiration. So when you breathe out normally, how much air do you still have left in your lungs? That's what it is. And then finally, if you look at everything all together, your total lung capacity, or all the volumes put together. You do have some anatomical dead space, which is the volume that never contributes to gas exchange. It's the air that's trapped in your trachea and your bronchi. They're not involved in exchanging gases. So we call this anatomical dead space. It's just holding the air, but the air doesn't serve any purpose. And the last thing before we take some time to review is the non-respiratory air movement. So these are some things that are not used for respiration, but they might be used when we're expressing certain emotions or when we're performing a certain bodily function. So coughing, sneezing, for example, hiccups, we get hiccups sometimes, yawning, also laughing and crying. These are non-respiratory air movements. All right, so you've been sitting long enough, way long enough. Kept you way beyond what I normally do. So why don't we let's have you do some review of the lost my train of thought here. Of Boyle's law. Okay, so if you want to get up and walk, you can. If you just want to get together in a small group and just go through and explain Boyle's law to each other. So each of you, I want you to take a shot at explaining some part of Boyle's law and how it relates to respiration. So maybe one of you wants to explain Boyle's law. Maybe one of you wants to talk about how we bring air into the lungs, and then another person wants to talk about how you breathe air out of the lungs. It doesn't matter how you do it, but I just would like you to review that so you got that ingrained in your mind. So, are you planning on staying here? Are you planning on walking and talking? What are you planning on doing? You've been sitting a long time. It certainly wouldn't hurt for you guys to get up and walk a little bit, right? So it's up to you, whatever you want to do. Okay. You're tired?
Yes.
Oh, it's one of those days, huh?
Yeah.
Easy law to remember. All right, so my question to you is, do you want to go on? Do you want to take 10 minutes for a break? Or do you want to go for another 15 minutes and then take a break? What's your preference? I don't have a preference either way.
I don't care.
We'll do another 15 and then,
Sure, sure.
okay, we'll do another 15 and then we'll do it. And if I'm getting past 15 and you notice, just wave me down. Sometimes I get talking, especially when my voice isn't working very well, I seem to talk slower. All right. So what we're going to do now is we're going to talk about, we're going to introduce two more laws. Let me introduce to you Henry's law next. I know we have Dalton's law, but Dalton's law pertains to some of the stuff we're going to talk about a little bit later. So let's just talk about Henry's law. Oh wait, let's go back because I promised you I was going to come back to this. Okay, so drinking through a straw. So what's your tongue doing when you're drinking through a straw? Never thought of it, right?
Oh.
The tongue is pushed up toward the roof of your mouth when you bring the straw in. And then what do you do to your tongue? You drop your tongue. So what are you doing when you drop your tongue? What are you doing to the volume of the space between the roof of your mouth and your tongue? When you drop your tongue, what are you doing to the volume? The volume, which does what to the pressure? Decreases. So you're creating a negative pressure in your mouth as compared to the pressure of the liquid in the container. So what you're doing is you're creating a suction, which is a negative pressure, right? So then you bring that in. And then the liquid will continue to go into your mouth until what happens? Pressure equalizes because it's filled with the fluid, right? Usually then you swallow it. Then you have no more fluid in your mouth, so then what do? You bring your tongue back up to the roof of your mouth. And then you drop the tongue again, and you bring more in. That's how you drink from a straw. So, with little kids, some kids have a hard time learning how to drink from a straw because they have to learn that you have to drop the tongue. For us, you get used to it after a while. Some kids, they get it like that. Some real little kids. Some kids, it takes them long. There you go. Next time you drink from a straw, maybe you'll think about it. Drink from a straw and you say, hey, Boyle's law. There it is. Okay, so now we're going to talk about another one that you can relate to called Henry's law. And I have a video of Henry's law, an explanation of Henry's law on Blackboard for this week. Okay, so this is what Henry's law states, and then I'll explain to you what it really means, all right? Henry's law states that when a mixture of gases is in contact with a liquid, each gas will dissolve in the liquid in proportion to its partial pressure. That's a mouthful, right? Okay. So let me simplify Henry's law for you. Okay, so this is kind of a combination of Dalton's law and Henry's law. So I'll kind of introduce you to Dalton's law at the same time. Okay, so we have an atmospheric pressure of 760 millimeters, right? But what are some of the gases that you find in the mixture of air that we breathe into our lungs all the time? What are some of the gases? We don't have to name them all, just name some of them. Plants like one of them when it's in the ground. Fertilizer. Explosives. Nitrogen, yes, nitrogen. So nitrogen takes up most of the air mixture, but we don't use it, okay? But nitrogen is one. What's another one?
Hydrogen.
Yeah, sure. Obvious ones. Oxygen and carbon dioxide. Okay, good. So let's say we've got this mixture of all these different gases, but if you look at it, if you capture it in a jar, there's a certain percentage of that volume of gas that's going to be made up of nitrogen, right? And there's a certain percentage of that's going to be oxygen and carbon dioxide. Okay. But nitrogen is most of that, right? So it's the highest percentage of that gas mixture. So what Dalton's law says when you have a mixture of gases, the one that takes up the most volume is going to be exerting the most pressure. So what they call that is a partial pressure, because it is the pressure of that gas. It's a partial pressure amongst all the pressures combined in that space or in that volume. Okay? So the higher the partial pressure, the higher the percentage of that gas in the mixture. Does that make sense? So if I have a partial pressure of 200 millimeters mercury versus a partial pressure of 50, then you know that there's a higher percentage of that gas in the mixture because it has a partial pressure of 200. Does that make sense? So the more of the gas present in the mixture, the higher the partial pressure. Okay? That's what a partial pressure is. And that's basically what Dalton's law is that each of the gases has its own partial pressure that's relative to the amount of that gas in the mixture. But partial pressures can change depending on where you are. Okay, and we'll get to that next, but we have to talk about Henry's law. So Henry's law states that each gas has its own partial pressure, and the higher the partial pressure, the more readily that gas will dissolve in a liquid. Gases, on average, do not like to dissolve in liquids. They don't like to. But you can make gases dissolve in a liquid by increasing the pressure. That's how you make gases dissolve in fluids. Okay? So we still might not be making a connection here, which is fine. But we'll use an example that everybody knows. Let's say this is a soft drink. Okay? It's not. Water bottle I fill up every day and refill and refill. Okay, but let's say that this was a full bottle of a soft drink. One of you have a soft drink? No? You're not thinking for your soft drink? Okay. So maybe you can grab it and say, hey, you got it. Okay, so if this was a full, unopened soft drink bottle, if I did this with it, would it do much? Okay, you see a couple bubbles, right? Wouldn't do much though, right? What happens when I open it up? What do you hear? Pop, if it's a can, or if I unscrew it, what do you hear? You hear the hiss, right? The release. What's that hiss? Gas. What gas? Dioxide. Because what's the first ingredient in the soft drink? Carbonated water, right? It's water that's been carbonated. It's water that has carbon dioxide in it. So why is the carbon dioxide releasing when you open up the bottle? Go ahead.
Because when you open it, you're releasing the pressure.
Exactly. You're releasing the pressure. And what do you see occurring inside the fluid when you release the pressure? Bubbles rise into the surface, right? That's Henry's law. Carbon dioxide does not like to be in liquid, but you can force the carbon dioxide into the liquid by pressurizing it. When you pressurize it, carbon dioxide dissolves into liquid. So when it's pressurized and you haven't opened it yet, and you slosh it around, not much is going on because the carbon dioxide is pressurized and it's stuck in the liquid. As soon as you release the pressure, now you see the bubbles rising to the surface. The carbon dioxide has been released from the liquid and now it manifests, shows up as a bubble, and it's rising to the surface. It's escaping from the liquid because it doesn't want to be in the liquid, but it was forced to by increasing the pressure. That's Henry's law. So you can increase the solubility of any gas by increasing the pressure. That's what you call it. They call it a solubility coefficient. And different gases have different solubility coefficients. So carbon dioxide has a low solubility coefficient, which means it doesn't like to be in liquid. Oxygen also has a low solubility coefficient. It doesn't like to be in liquid. But you can force it by increasing the pressure. So this is where we end up with the application of Henry's law in something that what we call nitrogen sickness. What happens when a person goes deep sea diving? What happens to the pressure exerted upon their body as they go deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper? Increases, right? Yes. So they're breathing air in. What's the highest percentage of gas in the mixture? We don't use it. Nitrogen. So we have nitrogen in our blood, but it's just floating around. We don't use it, and then it's back way through the lungs again. So now we've got this nitrogen gas that normally is traveling through the blood undissolved. Problem. But what happens? Happens to the pressure? Increases. So what does that do to nitrogen? It makes it more dissolvable gas, right? So now nitrogen dissolves in the gas. I mean, into the blood, into the liquid. So if we come up slowly from that deep dive, we come up slowly, not a problem, because as we come up slowly, then the pressure gradually decreases, and then the nitrogen will peacefully come back out of being dissolved in the blood, no problem. What happens if we come up very quickly? Now, it's like opening that soda bottle. Now what happens is we get nitrogen bubbles in the blood. Not good. Called the nitrogen sickness, or the hyperbaric sickness, whatever you want to call it. So that can cause the bends, they call it. So that's an application in real life of how Henry's law can affect us. We don't see that though. All right. Is that close to 15 minutes? Close enough. Close enough to at least we won't get into it. Because what we're going to do next is we're going to talk about Dalton's law and stuff like that. So I guess what we'll do is we'll stop here, we'll take a break, and we come back, we'll dive into the information on the bottom of page 3, and between page 3 and 4, that's the rest of the meat of this, and then the rest is pretty much downhill. So we don't have too much more that's really mind-boggling new. All right? You okay?
Yeah.
If you have a soft drink and you drink it with a straw, you'd be applying both Boyle's law and Henry's law at the same time, right? Or at least witnessing both. Let's take this down. We don't need that here. All right. So we're back. All right. So what we're going to do now is we're going to look at how the gases intuitively know to go from the blood into the tissues where the tissues need the oxygen, and how the tissues know how to get rid of the carbon dioxide and push it into the blood so it can go back to the lungs and get rid of it, right? So somehow, some way, the gases have to be encouraged to go in, the oxygen has to be encouraged to go into the tissues where it needs it, and the carbon dioxide needs to be encouraged to come out of the tissues so that it can go back to the lungs and be breathed out as a byproduct, right? So we're going to look at how that occurs, how this happens. And let's go back to a concept. Here's your first term. Oh, I didn't go. Well, let me get this up here. There's people who are watching won't see the term. Okay. Here's the first. Gosh, darn it. Printing thing always comes up. So here's your first term, capacity. Good? Okay. Don't focus on this yet because we'll come back to that in just a little bit. All right, but what I want to come back to, what I do want to talk about, because this will make it a whole lot easier if you understand this concept, which is a concept you already know, and that's this. When we have a higher pressure on one side of a membrane than the other, which way is the gas going to move? High to low. You bet. Each and every time, right? Okay. What if we have a higher partial pressure on one side? So let's say we have a higher partial pressure of oxygen. This is how you write partial pressure, by the way. You put P and then you have the gas here as a subscript. So a higher partial pressure of oxygen on one side, the other. Which way is the gas going to move? High to low. Really tough, right? That's it. Okay? So if you understand this, then you already know how gas moves from the blood into the tissues and why carbon dioxide moves from the tissues into the blood. You'll see why. Okay? Coming back to Dalton's law here, this is what we look at. So this is the mixture of gases that we find in the air, the approximate percentage, and then these are the partial pressures. These are the partial pressures of each of those gases, and then when you add that up, it comes out to 760 millimeters mercury. You can see the highest percentage of gas carries the highest partial pressure, and so on and so forth. Make sense? Oops, that wasn't, this is, it's my erasing sound. All right, sorry. So, highest percentage carries the highest partial pressure. Now, kind of what we're talking about here. Look at the atmospheric, the regular air, okay? 760 millimeters mercury. Okay, look at the partial pressure of two gases specifically, oxygen and carbon dioxide. You see how partial pressure of oxygen, 159, the partial pressure of carbon dioxide is very low, 0.3. Now let's move on to the alveoli. Over here, in the alveoli of the lungs, look at the partial pressure of oxygen. 104 as compared to 159. And look at the partial pressure of carbon dioxide, 40 compared to atmospheric pressure. Why is the partial pressure of carbon dioxide so much higher in the alveolus? And why is the partial pressure of oxygen lower in the alveolus than in atmospheric pressure. Why? Here's the alveolus, because you've got carbon dioxide that's being returned to the alveolus so you can breathe it out, right? So you've got a higher percentage of carbon dioxide in here than atmospheric pressure because you've got resident carbon dioxide in the alveolus. That's why the partial pressure is higher, okay? That's why we're going to see that. And that's why oxygen is lower, because carbon dioxide is taking more space in the alveolus than in atmospheric pressure. So there's less room. Well, I should say the mixture is made up of less oxygen. There you go. Okay, I could just use that for my thing. All right, so can you read numbers? Hopefully by now you can. Okay, so this is what we're going to do. We're going to go around the clock, and we're going to show you the numbers. And then it's really easy to understand. Okay, so we already talked about the partial pressure of oxygen in the air that we're breathing in. So the air in the atmospheric air, we have about 160 millimeters mercury partial pressure of oxygen and about 0.3 millimeters mercury of partial pressure of carbon dioxide. Okay? When we breathe it in the alveolus, we're at about 104 millimeters mercury for oxygen and 40 millimeters mercury. We already explained why the partial pressure is lower for oxygen and higher for carbon dioxide than the atmospheric air, right? And we're all understanding that. Is that correct? We all know? We're all intelligent now about that? Okay, good. Now, as the blood starts to move through the circulation, we're going to see a drop in the partial pressure of oxygen again. That's because our tissues are using it. Remember, our alveoli need some of that, so some of that's going to drop. So, but the number we're looking at here is in the circulation, the blood that's basically leaving the lungs and entering the tissue capillaries. The partial pressure of oxygen is 100, and the partial pressure of carbon dioxide is 40. Okay, that's what we need to focus on. Okay, what's the partial pressure of oxygen? It's hard to read here, so you might have to look in your book. This is figure 2217. Does anybody have this in their book? What page is that?
826.
826. Okay, so page 826. Okay, you might want to look at this because it's easier. Way on the bottom here, what's the partial pressure of oxygen? What does it say?
40.
There's actually less than 40, but we can go with 40. Fine, 40 works, right? Okay, here we go. So in the blood, partial pressure of oxygen is what? 100. Down here, it's 40 in the tissues. Which is bigger? 100 or 40? 100, right? This is really tough, okay? So if we have oxygen with a partial pressure of 100 here in the blood, and we have oxygen with a partial pressure of 40, which way is the oxygen going to move? From high to low or low to high? High to low until what? It equalizes. Okay? So is it any surprise when the blood leaves the tissue and enters the lungs, the oxygen is at 40 millimeters mercury? Are you surprised by that? Not anymore, right? Makes perfect sense. Cool. Anybody confused by that? This is as hard as it gets, really. Okay? So what's the partial pressure of carbon dioxide here in the blood? 40. What's the partial pressure of carbon dioxide? Greater than 45. Okay, we'll say 45. 40 in the blood. 45 in the tissues. Okay. So, what's it going to do? High to low until it equalizes. We're always getting 45. We get an endless supply of 45, so this move up to 45. So is it any surprise here that the blood leaving the tissues and entering the lungs has a partial pressure of 45 for the carbon dioxide? See, that's it. So then it returns to the alveolus. And now we have a partial pressure of 100 versus a partial pressure of 40. So we compare 104 to 40. Which way is oxygen going to move? Into the alveolus or out of the alveolus? Right, we're going to reoxygenate it, right? And then we see that the partial pressure of carbon dioxide is 45 compared to 40. So we're going to get rid of the carbon dioxide. See? So this is how it works. Really tough, right? So that's how we get the gases into the tissues and out of the tissues. Just the difference of partial pressures until they equalize. That's it. Dalton's law. Simple enough? We all on board? Any of you confused? Just captivated, enchanted, just wow, this is just great stuff, isn't it? It's like the most exciting thing ever, right? It's easy though, not hard. Okay. So here's another concept. This is a concept that's a little more like, what? Okay, well, it's just showing you here that the oxygenation of blood in the capillaries increases over time. So the longer the blood is in the capillary, this is in the pulmonary capillary now, this is in the lung. The longer it's in the lung, the more oxygenated it becomes. So that's a no-brainer, right? So by the time the blood leaves the pulmonary capillary, it's at its 104, but then it decreases to 100 when it circulates throughout the body. Okay, here. Now this is another topic. Now this one's kind of like the, really? Okay. But it's not hard. It's just one of those things that people discovered, and it's all relative. So we can figure this out. Okay, so this is called ventilation perfusion coupling. And by the title itself, it's really exciting, isn't it? I mean, you're just like, oh, yay. Ventilation perfusion coupling. I can't wait to talk about this, right? It's so exciting. But really what it is just that the rate at which the blood passes through an area is going to be matched to its oxygen demands, okay? So tissue that needs the oxygen more, your blood flow is going to adjust to accommodate that, right? So if a tissue needs more oxygen, the blood is going to hang around longer so that it can get more oxygen, okay? So if you picture it like a truck passing through, carrying food, and some people are saying, you know what, we've got food, we've got enough food and food to spare. Is the truck going to stop there very long? Probably not, right? A truck carrying food is saying, hey, do you need food? And people are standing there at the truck stop saying, you know what, we've got all the food we need plus some. Is the truck going to stay there very long? No, it's going to move on. But if you've got people who are starving and say, yes, we need lots of food, that truck is going to stop for a long time there, right? So that's basically what happens here in ventilation perfusion coupling. All right. So what we see here, here is a this is confusing, I think. Looking at this diagram, it's just more confusing. Let's see here. So read what it says at the bottom of page 3. I think that's easier to understand. So oxygen uptake into the arterioles, feeding areas with low partial pressure of oxygen constrict. Okay. So what we see here is that right now, this area here is not getting enough oxygen. Okay, that's what they're showing you. So what happens is the blood vessels constrict to slow down the flow of blood through that area. It's like slowing down the truck, giving more time for the oxygen to move from the blood vessel into the tissue. Does that make sense? How do you slow down traffic? You congest things, right? Traffic has to get slower because there's more congestion. So by narrowing the diameter, you're causing more congestion, so you're increasing the oxygen uptake. Does that make sense? So you're matching the flow of blood to the oxygen demands. Here we can see that we're full here. We've got plenty of oxygen. So what happens is we dilate the blood vessel so that the blood passes through more quickly. So then you're stopping less. So it's like the truck is moving by at highway speeds. You're not stopping to drop off the oxygen. Okay, this is what ventilation perfusion coupling is. So in areas, this is it in summary. In areas where you have high oxygen demands, you're gonna constrict the blood vessels to slow down the blood so you have more time to distribute the blood. That's just the oxygen, I should say. Okay, and in areas that have plenty of oxygen, that have low oxygen needs, the blood vessels are going to dilate so that the blood moves through more quickly because you don't need the oxygen. That makes sense? You follow me on that? Okay, that's what it means. Looking at the picture itself, I think, is confusing. Okay, that doesn't work. Let's fix this. Okay. Holy mackerel. That okay. Let's just stay with this picture before we move on. Okay, there are two definitions I just want to make you aware of, and the difference between the two. One is called, that cough or sneeze?
Please.
Bless you. All right, there's something called external respiration, and there's internal respiration. Okay. It has nothing to do with these pictures here. I'm just looking for a space to write, all right? External respiration, do you have these definitions here? No, you have internal. No. Okay, external respiration is the exchange of gases within the lungs. That's what it is. Okay, external respiration is the exchange of gases within the lungs. Picking up more oxygen, dumping off the carbon dioxide. Okay, so external respiration is the exchange of gases within the lungs. Alveoli specifically. Internal respiration is the exchange of gases within the tissues, or between the tissues and the capillaries. Okay, but it's the exchange of gases at the tissue level. So the tissues are picking up the oxygen and dumping off the carbon dioxide. Okay, this is the difference between internal and external respiration. In case you are asked that or you need to know that for some reason. Okay, the last thing that's really going to twist your brain a little bit is the transport of respiratory gases by blood. All right, so remember, when you think about Henry's law, do gases like to be dissolved in liquid? No, they don't. Okay, so when you look at Roman numeral number 3 on page 4, oxygen transport, it says because molecular oxygen is poorly soluble in blood, meaning that oxygen doesn't like to be dissolved in the blood, only 1.5% of the oxygen is dissolved in the plasma. How could we get that to increase? What could we do to the pressure? We could increase it, right? Yes, we could increase it. Okay, so that's one way we could do it. So we have 98.5% of the oxygen that does not want to be carried in the blood. So what we do is we bind it to a molecule called hemoglobin. And then hemoglobin carries the oxygen. So 98.5% of your body's oxygen is carried by hemoglobin. You could do up to 4 oxygen molecules on one hemoglobin molecule. And the thing is, hemoglobin is selective in how strongly it binds to oxygen. And so there are different factors that determine how readily hemoglobin will hang on to oxygen versus let it go. So hemoglobin is designed, and the body's mechanisms for doing this is pretty cool. Hemoglobin is designed to be more generous with hemoglobin to the areas that need it, and to be less generous when the areas don't need it. So if you have an area that has high oxygen demands, hemoglobin's like, here, have it, take it. And where there is low oxygen demand, hemoglobin's like, well, you don't really need it, so I'll hang on to it and bring it to somewhere that needs it more. But there are different factors that we look at that determine how closely hemoglobin binds to the oxygen. And that's called the affinity for oxygen of hemoglobin. So on average, hemoglobin hangs on to oxygen. When we look at the affinity of hemoglobin to carbon monoxide, however, I can't remember what it is. I can't remember what it is. It's something like 30 times more readily binding to carbon monoxide than oxygen, hemoglobin. So hemoglobin loves carbon monoxide. That's why carbon monoxide poisoning is so dangerous, because you might not even know you have exposure to carbon monoxide, but your hemoglobin is binding to that. It's like someone like me, I love chocolate cake or chocolate anything, candy bar, whatever. So if you offer me saltine crackers or you offer me a candy bar, I'm going to take the candy bar every time, right? And that's kind of like hemoglobin and oxygen. Oxygen is kind of like the saltine crackers, like, okay, yeah, okay, it's fine. But man, when it comes to chocolate, it's going to take the chocolate every time. So hemoglobin binds to oxygen when it's available. The problem with carbon monoxide is your body can't use it for anything. So all the hemoglobin is gobbling up the chocolate, but now it's not, that is not usable. And now hemoglobin just hangs onto it, says, well, I'm waiting for someone to use this. And the body's like, I don't need it. I don't need it. I don't need it. So hemoglobin just hangs onto the carbon monoxide. Meanwhile, your body is being deprived of oxygen, and eventually you're going to die because you don't have enough oxygen to supply your body's needs. So you die because hemoglobin's walking around going, hey, anybody need this? And the body's like, no, I don't need carbon monoxide. So you end up dying. So anyway, so there are different things that determine how closely hemoglobin is going to hang on to oxygen. And we look at these different factors, and they have them shown in your notes and also in your book. Okay. So the number one determinant of how readily hemoglobin is going to hang on to oxygen, number one always is the partial pressure of oxygen. So if the partial pressure of oxygen is higher, hemoglobin is going to hang on to the oxygen. Okay? So look at this picture here. This is what it's trying to show you. Use my laser pointer. If you look here, the partial pressure of oxygen is shown here across the bottom. The percent saturation of hemoglobin is here. So as you move across to the right, you can see that the percent saturation goes up. So at 100 millimeters mercury, look at the saturation of hemoglobin. It's almost full. It's 98%. So is hemoglobin letting go of the oxygen here? You're shaking your head no, and you're correct. It is not. So hemoglobin is like, you don't need it. You got plenty. So I'm hanging on to it, okay? But as we move into a partial pressure of 40 millimeters mercury, what's the percent saturation here? It's about 75%. So if the percent saturation of hemoglobin is down to 75%, that means that hemoglobin is lightening up. It's letting go of the hemoglobin, because now 25% more of the oxygen is available for the tissues that need it. See? So partial pressure of oxygen is the #1 determinant on how readily hemoglobin is going to let go of the oxygen so it can go somewhere else. Okay? That's one factor. So at high altitudes, the partial pressure of lungs of only 80 millimeters mercury, it's still a high saturation. Okay? That's what they're trying to show you here. So if we have resting tissues and we're at that 40 millimeters mercury, we see the 75% saturation. But what if you're actively exercising, really working those muscles? Now look at the partial pressure. Drops to 20 millimeters mercury, and you can see that we have below 40, or about a 40% saturation. So you can see now that as the partial pressure continues to decrease, hemoglobin is like, yeah, take it, right? It's more likely to give it up, okay? So partial pressure is the #1 determinant. Here's your second term for today, breathing. Another one is temperature. So when your body's exercising, are you gonna have a higher or lower body temperature when you're exercising? A higher body temperature, right? Exactly. So what they're saying here is that at normal body temperature, we have a certain affinity for oxygen depending on the partial pressure. But you can see that if the body temperature increases, you can see that that percentage drops. So the higher the body temperature, the more likely hemoglobin is to let go. Okay, so partial pressure is 1. So the lower the partial pressure, the more readily hemoglobin gives up the oxygen. The higher the body temperature, the more readily hemoglobin is going to get rid of the oxygen. And also carbon dioxide levels. So the higher the carbon dioxide levels, the less hemoglobin is going to hang on to it as well. This is related to something called the Haldane effect, letter B, #2 on page 4. And so if the oxygen saturation or the oxygen partial pressure decreases, there's more room on the hemoglobin for carbon dioxide to be carried, because carbon dioxide can also be carried on hemoglobin. So basically, if you free up some seats on the bus, carbon dioxide can come and sit down and take those seats. That's a Haldane effect, all right? So with the increase in carbon dioxide, we also have an increase in, we have a decrease in the pH, more acidic. So that's what we see here. I think this picture just confuses people more than it helps. But what they're trying to show you here is how oxygen and carbon dioxide are carried on the red blood cell. So through primarily hemoglobin for oxygen, but for carbon dioxide, a little bit different. 20% is carried on hemoglobin. If you look under letter B, #1, 20% is carried on hemoglobin. 7 to 10% is dissolved in the plasma, and then the rest is carried through bicarbonate as part of the buffer system. So that's what they're trying to show you there. Okay, so even though it's relatively simple, what I'd like for you to do is I want you to, again, regroup. I want you to just talk through a couple things that we talked about. So I want you to discuss how the gases are exchanged, why, relative to the partial pressures. Remember, higher partial pressure of oxygen in the blood versus the lower partial pressure of oxygen in the tissues, how we have the movement of gases. And then I want you to also just reiterate to yourselves and talk about the factors that we talked about. There's another factor called BPG, and that has to do with women who are pregnant and the fetus. You could be aware that affects the hemoglobin saturation, but it's not a focus. So the ones that I want you to identify are the blood pH, the partial pressure of carbon dioxide, and the partial pressure of oxygen, how those are relative to hemoglobin saturation of oxygen. Okay, so I just want you to talk about those two concepts briefly before I move on, because then we're going to finish off. We're almost done. Okay, so I'll give you a few minutes just to do that.
Just remember.
We got it. There you go.
Ready to move on?
Mm-hmm.
All right, we're almost done. This is we're getting there. All right. Okay. We're gonna jump ahead to what I think is the more important point of the most important point of the remaining points we have, which aren't many. So if you skip ahead to page 5 in your notes, letter B, the factors influencing the breathing rate and depth. This is really what it comes down to. If you want to summarize number 1 under B, that the stimulus for breathing is directly tied to carbon dioxide levels. The only reason why you breathe or you take a breath in is because carbon dioxide levels are becoming high, right? If you hyperventilate and you push down your oxygen levels, then you can go a longer time before you have to take a breath. So if you ever want to enter a breath holding contest, hyperventilate first, then you can hold your breath longer because you're pushing down the oxygen levels, and then it takes longer for them to rise up to a level where now you're receiving the stimulus from the sensors, the chemoreceptors saying, we need to take a breath. We need to decrease the carbon dioxide levels. We need to just decrease the acidity in the blood. So a newborn doesn't breathe until carbon dioxide levels reach a threshold. When it reaches that threshold, then the infant will breathe for the first time. Okay, so that summarizes 1. How deep and how often and how much you breathe is directly tied to carbon dioxide levels. There you go. Number 2, the higher brain centers alter the rate and depth of respiration. So basically, if you are experiencing strong emotions, that can affect your breathing rate. Obviously, if you're scared, you're in a lot of pain, you're going to breathe differently. That goes without saying. That's pretty straightforward. And you can consciously override your body's normal automatic respiratory controls consciously, as long as you're getting adequate oxygen. Don't. You hold your breath, or you're deprived of oxygen somehow, some way, until you pass out. Once you pass out, then your body is going to breathe on its own again through its normal mechanisms. So you can override that as long as you're getting adequate oxygenation. Talking, laughing. Laughing is a great way to get oxygen into your system. There are different ways you can do that, but basically, your higher brain centers can be overridden by your conscious control as long as you're getting adequate oxygen. Fair enough? Easy enough? Okay. So we have 2 reflexes. We have the irritant reflex. So if you inhale an irritant, basically your respiratory airways are going to constrict, so you get less air into your lungs, and you're gonna not breathe in. So I mean, there's a natural reflex to keep you from inhaling more of that irritant. Okay, that's the pulmonary irritant reflex. And then we have the inflation or Herring-Brewer reflex. This is really exciting. It keeps your lungs from overinflating. So if your lungs reach a certain degree of stretch that your body deems to be too much, then you will reflexively just breathe air out of your lungs so you don't overinflate your lungs. Cough. You might just breathe out. Sometimes it's a cough. So it's protecting the lungs from overexpansion. Easy enough? Okay, So a couple more things to cover here. We're going to back up now and we're going to go into actually to the end of page 4, the control of respiration. This is pretty much carried out by 2 areas in the medulla. We have a dorsal respiratory group called the DRG here. And we have a ventral respiratory group. You can see where they're both located here. The dorsal respiratory group is right here, and the ventral respiratory group is right here. Okay? So, the ventral respiratory group is going to drive the respiration, the rhythm of respiration. So the ventral respiratory group in the medulla is basically going to allow you to breathe without having to think about it or worry about it. The dorsal respiratory group is going to modify the rate and the rhythm. Then you have the pontine respiratory center, which is going to smooth out the respiratory pattern. It's going to coordinate the inhalation versus the exhalation. For the most part, we have, during normal restful breathing, top of page 5, letter A, we have the inspiratory neurons. So basically, the inspiratory neurons are stimulated, and then they're not stimulated. So when they're stimulated, you're breathing in, and when they're not stimulating, you allow the elastic recoil to allow the lungs to empty. Okay? If you do need to forcefully exhale for whatever reason, then the expiratory neurons can fire and then cause contraction of the respiratory muscles. Okay? We normally breathe at a rate of about 12 to 15 breaths per minute. That's all I have to say about that. Should have another attendance term coming up. Yep, PONS. We talked about the influences on respiration. That's what we talked about with the carbon dioxide level. So that's kind of what we're talking about here. Basically, we just have a few more things to talk about here. Get out of this. And finally, if you look at the bottom page 5, respiratory adjustments, exercise. So obviously, when we exercise, we take deeper, more vigorous respirations. These are called hyperpnea, just to ensure that our demands for oxygen are met. We have 3 neural factors that contribute to the change in respiration. Could be psychic stimuli, could be cortical stimulation. That's the conscious control. Or skeletal muscles, so forth. And then finally, letter B, high altitude. So if we make a rapid transition from sea level to altitudes above 8,000 feet, this is called acute mountain sickness because the pressure drops, the atmospheric pressure drops. And when we have a drop in atmospheric pressure, it's harder for our blood to carry the oxygen. So basically, we need more hemoglobin to be produced, so we need more red blood cells. So at higher altitudes, you have sea level numbers of red blood cells. You experience that sickness until your body catches up by creating more red blood cells to compensate. Because you're in a state of hypoxia. Your body detects that. We don't have enough oxygen, so your body will compensate by producing more red blood cells. But it takes a while for that to happen. But if you're in high altitudes for a long period of time, long term, without realizing it, you increase your ventilation rate. You have a lower than normal hemoglobin saturation. That's because the partial pressure of oxygen is decreased. So when you have a decreased partial pressure of oxygen, now you have less oxygen available carried in the hemoglobin, but you also produce more erythropoietin, which causes an increase in red blood cell count. So your red blood cell count will increase. So that's all I have for us for today. So let's just go back and just kind of review a couple things here so we can make sure that we put a cap on all this. So what are the major forces? Let's do it this way. What's the role of the diaphragm in relation to breathing in and breathing out, which is called pulmonary ventilation? Go ahead.
Increase or decrease.
Okay, the increase and decrease in pressure. So how does your diaphragm contribute to an increase or decrease in pressure of the lungs?
So as it goes down, it's going to decrease the pressure.
Correct. So the diaphragm moves downward. We're going to decrease the pressure. Why?
Allow more of volume of oxygen to enter in.
Right. So by lowering the diaphragm, we increase the volume, which then we see an inverse relationship between volume and pressure, right? So volume increases, pressure decreases. So then the air will move from a higher atmospheric pressure into the lungs, right? And it'll continue to move in until what happens? The pressures do what? They equalize, right? Yeah. And then what happens when the diaphragm relaxes? What does the diaphragm do? Which direction does it move? Moves superiorly up, right? And then what does that do to the volume of the pleural cavity? Decreases the volume, so what does it do to the pressure? What's that law called? Boyle's law. Boyle's law. You got it. Boyle's law. Perfect. Okay. So we have our respiratory volumes. So what are some names of the volumes? Respiratory volumes. What's the one for normal breathing? Yep, the tidal volume. Okay, that's normal, about half a liter. Okay, if I told you to push all the air out that you possibly can, what's that called? Expiratory. You can look if you need to. It's fine. Expiratory reserve volume. Sounds right to me. Yep. And then what's the residual amount of, I gave you the term, what's the residual amount of air called beyond the expiratory reserve? Right, amount of air in the lungs after the expiratory. And what's that specifically called? Something volume. It's the residual amount of air left in your lungs. Residual volume, yeah. So it's a residual volume. So you have the tidal volume, we have the expiratory reserve, and then the residual. Okay, then what about the one where you take a deep breath in as much as you can get in? What is that called? It's also a reserve volume. The inspiratory reserve volume. Yeah, so you have the tidal volume, you have an inspiratory reserve, you have an expiratory reserve, and then in addition, you have that residual volume. So when you combine those volumes, then you get the different capacities, like the inspiratory capacity. So it's a sum of the tidal volume and the inspiratory reserve volume. The functional residual capacity. It's the residual volume and the expiratory reserve volume. And then finally, we have the vital capacity, which is the sum of the tidal volume, inspiratory reserve, and expiratory reserve volume. So that's like the amount of air you have at your disposal, the amount you can breathe in versus the amount you can breathe out. And then when you add that residual capacity, that residual volume, then that becomes your total lung capacity. Okay? So just be aware of those different capacities and what they mean. Okay, what does Dalton's law of partial pressures mean to you? So we've got a mixture of gases. What determines whether a gas has a higher partial pressure than others? What is that related to?
Concentration within whatever it was before. So like there's the atmosphere.
Yeah. So if you have a volume of gases, whichever gas takes up the most volume out of that mixture of gases, that one carries the highest partial pressure, right? It exerts the most pressure, so it's the highest partial pressure. So partial pressure is directly related to the percentage of the volume it takes up in space, right? And that's essentially it. Would that be accurate? Can you live with that? Okay. That's right. And so how does that relate to to the movement of gases between the blood and the tissues of the body? How do you utilize partial pressures to explain that? So what's the approximate partial pressure of oxygen in the blood that's passing through the arteries, the arterial side? Remember the number?
About 100
It's about 100. Okay, and then what's about the partial pressure of the oxygen in the tissues?
plus.
About 40 or less, right? Okay, so then we're going to see the movement of oxygen from high partial pressure to low partial pressure until they equalize at about 40, right? And what's the partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the arterial blood? About 40. And then in the tissues, it's about 45, right? Or is it the other way around? Five. It have to be higher. It'd have to be higher in the
Yeah.
tissues. 45
Yep.
versus 40, right? Yeah. So to equalize at 45. Move back. Yep. Is just to have an understanding of that, how that all works. Ventilation. Well, let's talk about Henry's law first. Henry's law. How would you explain Henry's law? That's exactly it. The higher the pressure exerted upon the gas, then the more readily it will dissolve in a liquid. Yes, that's exactly it. The solubility coefficient. So that explains why when you open up a soft drink bottle or a can of a soft drink, you get the release of the gas, right? So you open it up, you're decreasing the pressure, and you see the bubbles rising to the surface, right? Because the carbon dioxide is coming out of its dissolved state because it now the pressure is relieved, so now it comes out of the solution. Okay, that's Henry's law. Ventilation perfusion coupling, we talked about that a little bit. So if you have tissue that is not getting adequate oxygen, what's going to happen to the blood vessels? Are they going to constrict or are they going to dilate? Are you going to slow down traffic or are you going to increase traffic when an area needs more oxygen? You're going to constrict, you're going to slow down, right? And if an area has adequate perfusion of oxygen, or actually the adequate ventilation, one of the two, what's going to happen to the blood vessel then? It's going to expand, it's going to dilate, right? Because it doesn't need to slow down, right? Think of the truck stopping versus going forward. Yeah, perfect, nice. Okay, what are the factors that control hemoglobin saturation? So give me one factor that controls hemoglobin saturation. Temperature is one. So, okay, so what would make hemoglobin more likely to get rid of the oxygen? Decreased temperature or increased temperature? What was it? Increased? Yeah, you're right. Increased temperature. So think of exercising muscles. Increased temperature, so oxygen is going to be more readily given up by the hemoglobin. You got it. What's another one? CO2, carbon dioxide levels. So if carbon dioxide levels are high or low, what is it going to be to make hemoglobin more readily get rid of the oxygen? What would you think? Higher, yeah. Think about exercising tissues again. Exercising tissues create more carbon dioxide. So higher carbon dioxide, the more readily hemoglobin is going to get rid of it. So if we have higher carbon dioxide levels, what does that do to the pH? Or I should say, what does it do to the acidity? Increases the acidity, but remember, it drops the pH. So the lower the pH, the more acid it is. So if we have a lower pH, what does that do to the oxygen? I should say the hemoglobin affinity to oxygen. If we drop the pH, what does it do? More readily available, right? Yeah, exactly. So those are three main factors. We have the BPG, but we don't focus primarily on that. The three factors I want you to focus on, or I guess 3.5, would be number one, the partial pressure of oxygen is always number one, partial pressure of oxygen. Number two, temperature. Increased temperature, more likely to get rid of the oxygen. And then carbon dioxide levels, higher carbon dioxide levels, the more readily it'll get rid of it. And also related to carbon dioxide is pH. So the higher the carbon dioxide, lower the pH, the more acidic it is. It's going to be more apt to get rid of the oxygen as well with that. What is the most important factor that tells us to take a breath? Level of carbon dioxide. Yes. Yes. That's it. Yeah, nice. So those are the high points, those are the highlights, those are the things that you definitely want to know. You want to definitely have a grasp of. It sounds like you got those concepts. So looking ahead to this week with your assignments and so forth, I do have two videos that you can watch that might help reinforce things we talked about, but I think you've got a pretty good understanding of the different laws, so you should be good to go. But if you want to watch them for another way of explaining it, great. But if you understand these concepts that we talked about today, you should have no problem with your assignments and no problem with the exam. All right. Well, thank you very much. Have a good rest of the week.